Should be going live pretty soon. And we're on. Welcome to episode number 3, season 2. We got a special guest, Carlos here. I'm really glad to have somebody like him because I know people are going to be asking, why do you have someone, a conservative you're on here? But, I wanted to make sure that we interview people that, don't necessarily agree with us because sometimes then we have to, do that. So Carlos is a recent graduate from Portland State University, choosing to major in political science and minor in foreign language. Currently resides outside of Portland and has recently become more conservative leaning in American politics. So I present to you guys, Carlos, take it away, man. So let us know, a little bit about yourself.
Alrighty, definitely. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you guys very much for having me. I think we both agree that it is important for us to have these kinds of conversations between individuals that don't always agree with each other. Particularly, Hispanics are often, we're not all in agreement. Specifically when it comes to like on the East Coast versus the West Coast, because over here it's primarily Mexicans that have different issues than what Cubans and Puerto Ricans may have on the East Coast. So yeah, I think just thank you for having me. Now, to start off, I guess I would say that I didn't always, I started off as more liberal, I would say. I wasn't actually registered to vote for the 2016 election. I wasn't registered to vote until 2018 for the midterms, and that's when I voted for our current governor up here in Oregon, Kate Brown. And so I certainly considered myself to be a liberal back then. And it wasn't until the year afterwards in 2019 where kind of began a bit more of a transition politically across aisles. And this was primarily from an economic perspective. And that's when I came across this book called Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell. And in it, he talks about all kinds of things. But the main thing that changed my mind was my attitudes towards the minimum wage law. And because it was the first issue that where I thought it was actually kind of a good thing. Like I considered the minimum wage law to be a positive thing for people because it provides a livable wage. But in it, I would just like to read just one part of it where it discusses the minimum wage because oftentimes when we hear about minimum wage laws in public discourse, we talk about livable wage. And so this is kind of where I'm at. So livable wage for who, basically. And and in it, he discusses how younger workers are disproportionately represented among people with low rates of pay, and only about 2% of American workers aged 25 and over earn the minimum wage. And so that kind of got me thinking, well, are the living expenses for a 19-year-old the same as a 29-year-old, for example? And so I kind of came to the conclusion that I didn't think the livable wage was necessarily universal across age groups, especially if older people tend to have kids more. I mean, I would think that they have a higher livable wage. So that's kind of the very beginning of where I kind of started this bit of a transition, was kind of learning more about economics. And then from there, I got into learning more about capitalism and socialism and communism and all these sorts of things. And at that point, I kind of realized that maybe I wasn't exactly all that liberal to begin with. You know? So that's how that started with me switching over into more conservative leaning positions when it came to issues. And now perhaps maybe we can go on to one of the single biggest issues that I think is facing many Latinos here in America, and that is the issue of immigration. And I think perhaps this has mainly two parts to it. And it is the current crisis that we have at the border today and the undocumented people that live with us or have been living here for a few decades. And I think these are two separate issues that I think could be kind of addressed in different sorts of manners. And another thing is, especially with a little bit more of the radical elements in today's politics, is like a wider issue of colonialism is kind of invoked when we start discussing immigration. And for that, I would recommend this book called Harvest of Empire. It's a wonderful book about the history of Latinos in America. And the title in itself is indicative that the immigrants coming from Latin America to the United States are the harvest of the American empire, talking about the different times that the United States kind of intervened in these different Latin American countries that became, more unstable due to their interventions. And that sort of played a role into the reasons why people immigrate here to the United States, So there's lots of things that I'm sure, people on the left would definitely agree with for this book. But yeah, as far as the immigration issue is concerned, or what are your guys' thoughts on some of these sorts of things? Do you guys have any response or anything to what I have said?
Yeah, so before we even get into immigration, I mean, I just wanted to say that it's really interesting how, you said you used to be a liberal, right? And I think a lot of Latinos tend to be liberal for the most part, you tend to vote Democrat and, or have liberal ideas, uh, especially when we start going to college. But for you, it was kind of ironic because, you went to college and you became more conservative, right? Reading these things, right? So, and especially now in academia where it's pretty much run by the left or just by liberals, I find that very interesting how that ended up happening to you. I mean, I graduated from college, 10 years ago. So I think there's a big difference just in those 10 years. Because even though back then there was, most of the professors that I took classes with were liberal and stuff like that. Uh, there wasn't really this push towards leftism. You know what I mean? Like you still had that was a very radical or very little, a group of people who actually felt that way. But most people were either moderates or liberals, and some conservative too. I mean, not so much in college, but um, yeah. But now it's impossible to have any other opinion other than liberal or left leaning, in college. So it's really interesting how even though you were, and even Portland is a very liberal, city. You have Antifa there, right? So, really interesting how that took place. But as far as the immigration issue, Brown, do you want to ask any questions before I ask any questions? I think I might be a little frozen. There you
Yeah.
go.
So I have some not too much questions, but more of I guess questions and observations, and so really to break the definitions of liberal and what really you stand. I mean, what side of liberal were you of the liberal party were you? Because really, when we talk about being a liberal, is really being more towards like the more with liberty of what one stands for, right? In America, like being more towards like social change and things of that sort, right? Political change and things like that. So now, how much of that did you believe in when you were a liberal, and how much of being a conservative do you actually embrace?
Okay. Well, I guess when I talked about the more radical elements of liberals, what's invoking colonialism with immigration is, I guess back when I identified as a liberal, it was a bit more with the extreme ends, I would say, of that, because it's, obviously it's a bit of a spectrum. And it's kind of how I sort of got involved with La Raza in general. I started seeing, lots of different, I think memes are being shared from people that I knew that were from like these sorts of pages about kind of painting the United States as this sort of kind of enemy that was holding us back as individuals and marginalizing us as a group. And I very much believed in all that. I bought into it. I mean, La Raza Unidad, like it had this, I think I remembered it had this profile picture of the former Mexican territories, that the United States had taken in the Mexican-American War. So basically, there were things that I thought I agreed with. I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to become more involved in this. And so that's when I kind of got in touch with them, and I was able to kind of interact with them to a certain extent. But it wasn't until a little bit afterwards is when I started to delve deep into more of these other issues, starting with economics. So, but yeah, I very much embraced some of the more radical elements of that side. If that makes sense.
Why do you think that us, as you know, being Latino, why do you think that is like more like default to go radical? Is it because we just feel so inferior to the I guess what we call the ones in charge, or I mean, what do you think that is? That for the most part we want to be radical and take back what supposedly was once ours, but it's so far back in history that it's like we want to take it back, and it's like we want to do it in a radical form. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't think we're necessarily precluded to believing these sorts of things or leaning that way. I think it's just depending on which generation of, especially with Mexicans, depending on which generation grew up here, whether your parents came here or your grandparents came here. I think we're more or less kind of led to believe a certain way, primarily, liberals and Democrats, because of the immigration issue. I would think so, because I mean, we all have family that are undocumented, things like that. So I think that sort of plays one role of it into believing which side we're on. And also, I don't think we give very much. Well, I guess I'm talking about Mexicans specifically, because there are conservative Latinos, and we obviously, we don't always agree with them. But I don't think that there's as much of a conservative influence when it comes to Mexican American politics because of that, primarily because of that immigration issue. I think is the single biggest one. And so in short, I don't think we're necessarily led to believe these sorts of radical things. I think it's just easier given the history and given the current state of affairs with Mexicans in particular in the United States.
Good point. So, I mean, just I guess to answer your question regarding immigration, are you asking us how do we feel about immigration, or I'm a little confused?
I guess what I mean is, because I'm sure we can probably agree on some of the solutions for it.
Yeah.
And what I meant, but it was a really open-ended question, I guess. I should be more specific. Do you guys think that the solutions for our immigration issues, do you think our ethnic background and our historical legacies kind of allow us to be more free when it comes to moving back and forth between the United States and Mexico, basically, because of that historical background?
If you want to go based on the original treaty of Lupe Hidalgo, I mean, it said that we were allowed to, go back and forth. Obviously, things have changed since. I mean, I think when I was signed, it wasn't intended to have this, mass of people coming over. I mean, because they've been coming over since, and some, were made, American citizens overnight. Some chose not to. Obviously, they went back or stayed even as Mexican citizens. But as far as, having a right to be here, it's a very, very complex, situation, because I think if you ask, a radical Chicano, they would say, absolutely, this is our land. We belong here, like we've been here for millennia. There's people who identify with being indigenous. So they'll say, we've been here since, thousands of years. So, and they don't see borders, right? And that's a very romantic way of looking at things. And I was there at one point too. But now that I'm older, and even though my parents came as immigrants, I'm not against immigration. Obviously, I mean, if you want to come over, continue to come over. And I'm not even for a wall either myself. I mean, I think that's a waste of money, what I mean? But I also understand that the wall or the border is not just people coming over. There's drugs coming over. There's people getting kidnapped at the border. There's women getting killed at the border. So many other things that are happening at the border that usually we don't talk about because it's a sensitive issue, right? So I understand why people are also trying, especially if you live near the border, why they lean towards, okay, let's build a wall, or why they lean towards having a solution towards immigration. But me, this is, honestly, I lean more libertarian. So I'm more like, okay, well, come over. I mean, but at the same time, I don't expect handouts. You know what I mean? Because because I mean, my parents didn't get one. I mean, and maybe that's a little biased, but I think when you start giving out handouts, you also, you know, people don't get motivated by that. People are gonna depend on the government, and when you come over and and you build stuff and you build yourself, whatever that is, it just feels better at the same time. You know, you teach that to your kids, right? So like I said, my parents are immigrants, and my parents came here, quote unquote, illegally, right? And they had to do what they had to do, and I mean, my dad now is a U.S. citizen, so he's gone through the whole process. But that's my take on immigration. What about you, Brown?
Man, immigration, man, that's very touchy for many different reasons. And being a Latino, being a product of immigration, not I'm not an immigrant myself, but my family, we have stories. My parents came over, and luckily, I mean, they played their cards right. They learned English, they got their citizens and all that. But see, I guess it's a case by case thing, I guess, you know what I mean? Because I don't know what it is, whether it be from not being motivated enough to do that, and maybe kind of saying, well, this is our land, so why should I learn English when this was, originally there was no English, so they should adapt to us, really. So mentality is also what's keeping us down, because why not just become, now I wouldn't say blend in, because that's more like assimilating, but I just go with it, be the silent giant, and then come with the vengeance, you know what I mean? But that's how I play my cards. Like, I'm in the school system, and I may be, quiet in a lot of things, but I'm outspoken in the other stuff. So it's like, be that quiet person or unspoken person, and then come out with with real good intentions. So that's what I'm saying, man. There's a lot of things that keep us down talking about immigration, because it's a sensitive thing. We start talking about the wall, that in itself, people stop listening to you, because especially a Latino talking about the wall, because I mean, once they hear, like, well, I mean, we kind of fuck it up for ourselves too, because we come over and we, first of all, a lot of people are so proud of being Mexican in the States, but they wouldn't step foot into Mexico and try to fix problems out there. So I mean, think about it, bro. I mean, people are gonna hate me for saying that shit, bro, but if you really have a logical brain, that just makes sense, bro. Why are you gonna come over here and splurge on shit when over there is fucked up, bro? Over there, they killing babies out there, man, on some petty money type shit. The cops are fucking stealing from the people, bro. Yeah. And I seen it. I've been in Mexico, and they've jacked my ass many times, bro. The cops. So I know firsthand that they're fucking crooks, man. And why is it like that? Because they allow it. Because, I mean, it's not that they allow it, because the people have stood up for what belongs to them and for their rights. And it's not like the States, bro. It's not like USA. They don't care about the rights. You talk about rights to the cops out there, they laugh at your face. Derechos? Derechos tú? Derechos? They don't got, bro, you ain't got no rights out there, man. Mm-hmm. And that's why I love America, bro. That's why.
Oh, there it is. There's the clip, bro. That's gonna be the clickbait right there. I love America. What are your thoughts, Carlos, on immigration? I mean, I know you mentioned that obviously that the U.S. foreign policy has affected immigration in pretty much all over Latin America. I agree with you. Every time that Latin America wanted to, rule itself, the U.S. would step in and say, no, we don't want you to rule yourselves. We want this guy to rule. And, a lot of the times these countries tended to lean towards socialism. So I think Cuba was the only one that was able to really do it. But look at them now. You know what I mean? Their citizens are fighting against the regime that's been there for, what is it, 60, 70 years? I mean, so, I mean, yeah, like it's it's very complicated. But what are your thoughts on it, man?
Well, to an extent, I do agree that the United States did intervene many times over in many of these different countries, but I think that's probably where I would probably stop agreeing, because I mean the implication after that would mean that the United States somehow prevented individuals from prospering in their own countries, and to an extent, I guess that case could be made. But I guess the wider issue I would address is I would think that Spain probably had done more to exploit the peoples of this hemisphere, and moreover, they probably did more to give them cultures to kind of hold them back in a way. And the reason why I say that is because, well, for one, I mean, we have to recognize that the different places in Europe were obviously very culturally different and distinct, and Spain was fairly backward compared to the rest. I mean, they were a little bit more poor. And one interesting thing that I found about that is a good example is Argentina, which has primarily a population of predominantly European ancestry, meaning it's mostly Spanish people that had immigrated there, and that's what reflects in their demographic composition. But even though most of them are of European and Spanish ancestry, Barbados, which is a country in the Caribbean, has like 40% higher GDP than Argentina. And even though the people that now live in Barbados, they came to the Western Hemisphere as slaves, whereas the Spaniards arrived as conquerors in Argentina. And so what this kind of went to show is that the inherent culture from Spain was no more economically productive in the Western Hemisphere than it was in Western Europe, where Spain has long been one of the more poorer countries. And moreover, in Barbados, I mean, the people that lived there, they were able to absorb the British culture, in which they lived longer than the peoples of sub-Saharan Africa from which they came. And the British culture was very different from the culture of Spain as it regards, the values attached to work, education, and entrepreneurship. So in short, I think we inherited some of the, lesser tier of European cultures, because if you look at history, Spain had just finished reconquering the Spanish, or excuse me, the Iberian Peninsula, like literally right before they
Yeah.
came here.
Mhm.
And so they kind of started as a country of they began as a country that acquired their national unity and built a huge empire by being soldiers and crusaders, not by being merchants and craftsmen. So many of these, skills, the other Europeans had those higher skills that would have benefited, had they conquered us, it probably would have rubbed off on us a little bit more. So I think, in short, probably the culture in Spain probably did a little bit more to hold us back in the long term when it comes to becoming more prosperous relative to other places in the hemisphere. Does that make sense?
That makes a
Sorry.
lot of sense. You know what? It's really interesting, huh? Because I mean, they're both European, like you said, and they're both white. So, uh, but I mean, I don't even take that into account. I mean, when we think about the effects of Spanish culture, I mean, basically still continuing to, and it's funny because a lot of people try to say we're not Hispanic or we're not Latino, whatever. I mean, that's to each their own, but the culture is still there, in our families, and a lot of that, you know, uh, a lot of the people who came here were probably some of the worst people, to ever existed in Spain. They were, soldiers. They were, thieves. They were people who they didn't bring their best, the whole, Mexico doesn't bring the best people. I mean, Spain didn't bring the best people over here. I mean, like they brought some horrible people over here. You know what I mean? So it makes sense, and they continue that. I mean, because basically the whole system was based on forced labor, right? Like you said, they didn't even allow people to the offspring of even their own offspring. They didn't allow them to move up, even if they were born in the same, born just because they were born in a different country, they didn't allow them to have the same position. So, that's ultimately what led to the war, right? I mean, because it had been oppressed for 300 years or whatever. But that is a really good point you make. So I didn't even think about that. I mean, that's pretty trippy, you know?
Yeah, and I guess one other point to that, 80% of the world's silver was in this like one mine in South America somewhere, and this obviously, enriched Spain so much so to where they didn't need to learn these sorts of, craftsmanship skills, like what is considered human capital, because I mean they could just, buy it, and they kind of developed this sort of disdain for, such inclinations. Um, and it also benefited the rest of the Europeans because I mean Spain was able to hire them instead of developing their own in-house skills, and this kind of rubbed off on to Latin America as well. And this is where it kind of gets complicated because on one hand it is sort of better that we were kind of, because it could have been the English, the British that came, but there are no reservations, Indian reservations in Mexico or in any other Latin American country. So I don't think it would have been better, I necessarily, if it was, the other way around, because a part of the whole crusading thing that in the Reconquista it was really religiously motivated, and
Mhm.
people over here, not obviously experiencing anything Christian or anything like that. It kind of gave them a reason to convert people, and they still recognize them as people willing, that have the capacity to be converted. Whilst if you look in the British colonies, they didn't have that at all. I mean, they were, I mean, Protestant. They weren't there to spread the word or anything. They were basically there to just move in and stuff. So I think that's why you see the different outcomes between the
It's a
interactions
good point too.
with natives here in the United States and then natives down in Latin America. So it's a little complicated to draw, which would have been best. It's very, very muddy, if that makes sense.
Ron, you have any comments?
I mean, what really separates being a Muslim and being back in that time, from Spain. They came over and in the name of their God, you know, what they did. So, now that we talk about how religion, causes it's a cause of violence, and back then it was a cause of change. That's how they seen it. Causes of change, something to control the wild. They seen us as the wild, as the beasts, as the out of control beings, and they want us to, keep us under control or to change us in their way, in their mirror. But I think it backfired, bro, because you know, I mean, they say that we're waking up or whatnot, but I think we've always known. It's just we're humble people, so we never wanted to raise the voice to say something about it, But now that we're kind of like waking up and talking about it more and being more open about it, it just seems like it's backfiring on them. You know what I mean? Because they want to change, they wanted to change us, but really they ended up being just the enemies of history. You know.
Cool. All right. So, I mean, aside from that, I mean, because you were going into, I guess, I'm assuming you're saying that culture really is the bigger factor when it comes to why certain groups do well and certain groups don't do well. Is that what you're leaning towards too, Carlos, or what was? I'm a little confused as to why you brought up the two different cultures.
Yeah, definitely. It is one factor in to explain why certain groups are able to advance more than others. Another thing I would probably note would be just geography. Really, when people are left isolated, they lag far behind the rest of society, or the rest of the other societies and civilizations. An example of this is that when the Spanish visited the Canary Islands in the Atlantic, they found a Caucasian peoples that were living in the Stone Age. And similarly, in New Zealand, some of the, no, Australia, excuse me, the native Aborigines there were also living, fairly, in the Stone Age, I guess. and they had no idea of iron, like how to like make iron and things like that, even though they're sitting on, you know, some of the largest iron deposits in the world. And so this is also kind of brings into the idea of, you know, uh, colonialism is definitely not a good thing. But if you look at Britain, for example, I mean, the Romans conquered the southern half of Britain. You know, that's where London comes from. You know, but they never conquered the north. And you can see afterwards how much farther advanced, you know, the southern Britain was compared to the northern Britain in terms of cultural development and economic development, because they were, you know, they had those connections to the wider world through being conquered by the Romans. And this is partly why Western Western European languages had written forms like centuries before Eastern European languages did. And so I think geography would be another factor into that kind of explains why some groups are held back. It's because, you know, being left isolated, like sub-Saharan Africa is another example where peoples are, I mean, they got oceans on 1, 2, 3 sides, and they have the Sahara Desert above them, and they have like 10% of the world's population, but a third of their languages because of how fragmented they are there. And you can see visibly those that had less contact with the outside world, whether that manifests in colonialism and things like that. I mean, they are visibly less poor than those that didn't have contact with the rest, if that makes sense. Maybe I probably said that a little
No,
bit
that makes
wrong.
sense. I mean, that is another really interesting point, you know, because people usually associate colonialism with something negative, and I would say most of the time, you know, there is obviously negative, you know, parts to it. But when you mention the whole British Isles, I mean, again, that didn't even cross my mind. I was like, that's true. I mean, the northern part is, you know, was less developed. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword, bro. It's a double-edged sword when it comes to that. You know, and again, people might say, well, why do we even need someone to come over? You know, we could have, you know, developed something bigger, right? I mean, for example, in Mesoamerica, you had the Mexica, you had the Maya, you had the Purepecha, right? Who were, you know, lived in cities. I mean, you know, so they might say, well, you know, I mean, they even had bigger cities or cleaner cities in Europe. So we didn't need the Europeans to come over, right? But you know, it's a really interesting way to put it, man. I didn't even think about it. So, you know, thank you for sharing that. Brown, you want to say something else?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about, you know, placement and you know, who benefited more and how. I mean, yeah, I mean that had a lot to do with it, I believe too, because like the Spaniards, they already were on knowing that humans put a value in resources like gold. You know, Aztecs weren't on that yet. I mean, they were using metals and stuff, but not to trade and stuff. They were using it for like, you know, I guess jewelry, you can say, you know, but they were not, you know, they were not doing that stuff. You know, they were trading. I think, I mean, how were they doing things? They were trading, right? Like stock, like livestock,
They
like
had
animals and stuff.
they didn't have the animals that we have today here. I mean, they would use cacao beans as they had a
Mm,
barter system, right? They didn't have capitalism like we have here today. So they would
no.
trade, you know, feathers for, you know, I mean, they put the value on the items themselves, which I would think is probably
Mm,
the best system we could ever have. But obviously,
yeah.
we don't live in that time anymore, you know, and that's a whole different
Mm.
conversation. But yeah, that's what they had, a barter system.
And I mean, the Spaniards came in with like on the malicious thing, you know what I mean? Like they already knew value. They were more towards the capitalistic side. So they came in with that aspect, with that knowing that, and took what they wanted, you know, kind of like manipulated the situation and you know, took it by force. So yeah, so it does depend a lot on location because
Mhm.
you know, they came from an area where they were all already knowing the value of things and knowing what they can, you know, I guess steal from other places and take it back as for
Yeah,
value. Yeah.
and it's a great point that you brought up, you know, Carlos, when you brought up the Reconquista, right? Period, because they literally had just come off that, right? So their mindset was, if you're not Christian, then you're an infidel. You know what I mean? We got to get rid of you. We either got to have to convert you, or we have to get rid of you. So they were already in that militant mindset, right? So that's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that when they came over, like I said, they brought the worst people over to this side of the world. They didn't bring entrepreneurs. They didn't bring people who can actually help the people out. They came here to destroy and take whatever they could. And, and they got rich off of stealing, basically, and one, I don't know if you were going to mention this already, but, they had so much silver, like you said, right, that eventually, it's ironic because they became broke because, it lost value because, they had so much of it. It caused inflation, so that's another thing that that people don't even look at too. But yeah, I think that's a good segue to how obviously historically we have been marginalized as a people, and I know you wanted to speak on that, Carlos. Expand more on that, and how that ties to your identity.
Yeah, certainly. And I guess I just want to be clear. I'm not making a case for colonialism. There are, I think Japan is a tremendous example of how a country can gain the benefits of being linked and connected to the rest of the world without necessarily being conquered, because they were never conquered, for one. And I think they experienced like a couple centuries of isolationism where they did lag far behind the rest of the world. And it wasn't until all that ended in like the 1850s, and then they became linked to the rest of the world, through mostly entirely peaceful means, because they weren't, physically conquered by anybody, but they were linked to everybody, and they were able to develop really, really fast and industrialize really fast to the point where they themselves are ready to conquer people, in the 20th century. But
I believe, though, I think they weren't conquered. I guess the current Japanese people, but I think the people who lived in that area, I think, were the Ainu people. It's really interesting because they look very different compared to other Asians. Like, they have a more like European look, the indigenous people of Japan. I don't know if you are aware of the Ainu people, but the Japanese, or descendants of Japanese, I think came from China or another part of Asia, if I'm correct. But more modern, yeah, they weren't colonized. I think that's what you're trying to say, though.
Yeah, basically. So there are examples of people gaining the benefits of being linked to the rest of the world without necessarily having to be conquered and colonized, if that makes sense. So I just want to be clear, I wasn't making a case for colonialism or anything like that, because that certainly was terrible for the people that experienced it, at least initially. But as generations go on and centuries move on, I think the cultural exchanges probably did more in the long run to help. But yeah, let's talk about marginalization. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because I think oftentimes when we talk about Latinos in American politics, is we bring up this idea that we are somehow marginalized as a group collectively. And I guess this is a bit more of a discussion item, but obviously from the conservative perspective, we're not marginalized. And that is primarily because, all of these laws that we have here in the United States apply to us equally. And I guess to suggest that we are marginalized because of certain disadvantages that we have, I think is an open question. We can probably get into those specifics, but I think in general, from the conservative side, we're not marginalized. I think we're probably better off and have more opportunities, at least all Latinos, I would say, than we would in our own homelands, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's just open for
discussion. That is a really, really good point. And I think this is where a lot of people either agree with us or don't disagree with us. I've been on that horse, or whatever you want to call it, that ride, in the last, 4 or 5 years, because I wasn't, we call it the victimhood mindset, right? Where a lot of our people feel like they're being victimized based on personal experiences. And I'm not here to say that, if you had a experience with racism, racism is never going to go away, in the sense that it's individualistic. And that's the thing that people usually hold on to, somebody calling me a beaner, somebody calling me a wetback, or they grew up with a lot of whites or whatever, so they personalize those experiences, understandably so. I would too if I grew up in an area like that. But as far as any legislation that has us marginalized. I mean, I can't name any unless I'm not looking hard enough, but there is no piece of legislation that says, just because you're Latino or because you're Mexican or whatever, then you can't do this. I can hear people say, well, what about immigrants, right? And what I would say to that is, well, that's not necessarily a race thing or ethnicity thing. It's more of a citizenship status thing, But then again, people are going to say, well, we all belong here and we should have the same rights as everybody else. And again, if you romanticize the whole Aslan thing, I mean, I get it, people are going to say that. And I was in that boat too, like I said, a couple of years ago. What made me change when it came to that was more of just looking at life through a scientific perspective. And what I mean by that is, seeing life through an evolutionary perspective, right? And I think that our ancestors, did what they could to survive, right? And it's really ironic because I think if you were to go back in those times and see what some of these people did, right, to be able to thrive in the society that they were growing up in, you'd probably call them conservative. You'd probably call them sellouts. You'd probably call them, weak or whatever and shit. But I mean, you have to put yourself in the perspective of, somebody who's Native American or Black and in this time. And when there are actually laws that did not allow you to do stuff, you had to find a way to thrive in that environment. And they still did, So obviously if they were fighting the system all the time, then they probably wouldn't be here. And a lot of us wouldn't be here because, they chose to be subservient to some extent. Again, you might say, well, what are you trying to say? I mean, are you saying that we should do that? No, what I'm saying is we should learn the system and play it, right? Mm-hmm. And I agree with you. I don't think we're marginalized, through any legislation, right? And I think that's been our biggest pushback from a lot of our listeners, a lot of our followers, is that, when we say stuff like that, they're like, well, are you even down with raza? Like, how can you say some shit like that? Like you're a sellout. I mean, what I mean? And to me, it doesn't bother me anymore. It used to, when I first started going through that transition, but not anymore, What about you, Brown? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, man. I mean, our people are very complacent. I mean, we tend to not really want to stand out, not really want to say what we really feel, because those are just values that we've been, given by our humble beginnings, our parents, our traditional, backgrounds. But I think this American way of being, this institutionalized way of thinking is what pushes people to be more critical instead of just more simple-minded. And I guess I can say it's kind of like the saying, ignorance is bliss. Like, it's just like the less you know, the simpler your life will be. But then there's issues that arise that make people be more critical. That, there's a lot of issues in the world that you really have to think with the critical mind to just, first of all, to just start off an argument and try to change those things, issues in the world. And that's, in the beginning, I'm assuming that politics started pretty simple, not too many, different, parties and stuff like that. But as time went by, now we have the green parties. Now we have all these different, So we sometimes make it more difficult because we try to please every single one, because it's always going to be someone in the future. There might be a LGBTQ party for all we know, because everyone wants to get pleased. And if everyone's not pleased, someone's always going to raise a hand. But what about me? But what about us? But what about me? So it's like we make it more critical as time goes by, and it's going to get way more complicated because we make it that way. Because, it just seems like, even like with kindergarten kids, you ask them about issues of the world, and right away they're like, you know what? We can do that. That just takes one simple answer. Why can't we just get along? But as adults, why can't we solve simple fucking issues of the world? Because of greed, because of power, because of all this shit. But like, those are just extra complications that we add to ourselves because of the opportunities. And who taught us this opportunistic way of thinking? Uncle Sam, right? So going back to the whole America, we live here, we love it, but then again, it comes with a lot of baggage, you know.
Go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, certainly. And as far as marginalization goes, I can't think of any sense of disadvantage, or at least demonstrably, that has advanced a group of people. I think perhaps it could be a little bit counterproductive, especially when you're trying to explain away just general disparities between groups of people, like racial disparities, for example. I think to invoke this idea of a wider society being involved or somehow playing a role in holding a group of people back, I think is a little bit more counterproductive, because it shifts the blame from an individual's own power and own control over their own outcome, and it kind of shifts it onto a wider society. And I don't think building up resentment towards a wider society is necessarily useful when it comes to advancing in economics and occupations and things like that.
That's a good point too. I think what you said too is the whole. It doesn't make sense to think that there is a group actively trying to hold us down. I think what the issue was back in the day when we had people doing that. Even back then, it was individuals. The difference was that, not everywhere, obviously, right? We just didn't have our rights protected. That was the issue. The government didn't care to protect individuals from killing us, from, putting signs that said no Mexicans or whatever, right? But because, people fought to have those rights, then they put it in legislation. That is the difference. The individual, incidents are going to continue to happen because that is a part of the United States. People are going to hate you for, quote unquote, being a foreigner to this country. But now we can actually fight it with legislation and say, well, you're being discriminatory. You can't do that, right? Back in the day, it was like, well, good luck, figure it out, and that's the difference between, the 50s and 60s, and today. And also, I would say that the only disadvantage we have as a raza is economics, which we're going to get into in a minute. It's, we don't have economic power, or we don't know how to use our economic power to make a difference, because a lot of us, will, if we have money, we'll use it to spend it on things that, don't really, they lose value as soon as you buy them, so, and it's not necessarily our fault. It's because a lot of us don't have anything. We came from nothing, so we want to show to the rest of the world, or to our people in our neighborhood, hey, I got this, and that makes you better than you. You know what I mean? Like that whole competition thing, which is also ingrained, I think, in our culture, because going back to the caste system, right? The only way to move up is to back in the day was to marry somebody whiter than you, and now it's like, well, the way to move up is by having more money than you, and a lot of us don't help each other out. So yeah, that's how I feel about that.
I beg to differ, bro, when it comes to, that they don't put signs up and say no Mexicans and all that. Mexicans can't prosper, or people of color can't prosper, because, they do have the advantage of knowing, who can economically afford living a certain way. So in those terms, through socioeconomic classism and all that, they keep us in a certain place. They keep us in our place, I guess you could say. So that is a new form of I guess, some say, this 9 to 5 is a new form of slavery. This way of keeping, like we said, marginalizing and keeping people in a certain area of the city where it's more predominantly, like higher rates of crime and all these bad things going on in those areas. They know where those things are, where those conditions are, and they keep the ones that are not socially, economically stable to prosper. So we are at a disadvantage, and they know it.
Do you think that someone's actively doing that though? Like, okay, like let's make sure these people don't come out of the situation. Like,
I don't think it's a certain group, but I do believe that the system caters more and gives more chances to those with power and money.
absolutely, I agree. What about you, Carlos? What do you think?
Well, it seems like we're already kind of sliding into the whole economics portion, so I guess it's a very good segue. Um, well, from I guess from the conservative perspective, it seems like we're talking a lot about capitalism and things like that, and I will agree with Brown to an extent that we kind of have conditioned ourselves to want to kind of flaunt our wealth to, especially to each other. And I guess maybe that's kind of developed some spending habits that aren't exactly ideal if you're trying to move up in the economic ladder. But just from the conservative perspective, I would say that definitely capitalism is probably the main engine that has driven people out of poverty in particular, rather than the reverse as to its keeping people, holding people back, which I don't believe to be true. But as far as economics goes, you can kind of already kind of guess that, conservative side is, fairly more oriented around the free market and the free exchange between mutually agreed upon exchanges between individuals. And perhaps maybe we can get started with that.
Yeah, I mean, would you say that we actually have capitalism here in the U.S. or, more like corporatism?
We have a mixed economy here in the United States. It's not a completely free market, but it's also not, it's not a centrally controlled market. And I would agree with you that, yeah, perhaps when the government intervenes in the economy, particularly on behalf of corporations, I think that is a tremendous disadvantage. Because the free market isn't necessarily the government coming in and kind of deciding things on to benefit one group. But I'm also not saying that completely no government involvement at all in the economy is necessarily the right way either. Because on one hand, we've also benefited a lot from the child labor laws that we've had, and kind of implementing all these safety regulations that I think definitely helped improve the workplace. This was back during, we had a bit more progressive trend when it came to the workplace to kind of make it better for workers. And I think that was definitely a good thing. So I'm not saying complete no government involvement in the economy, but just enough to where a free market can function. And that would mean, not bailing out these, corporations and things like that. That makes sense, because primarily when we talk about like things like monopolies, I think they're primarily, are able to be facilitated through the means of government intervention, especially when it comes to regulating the competition, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. I mean, the reason why I ask if we have more corporatism here in the United States is because you see how corporations, for me, I noticed this during the pandemic, how corporations didn't shut down. They didn't close down, and all the moms and pops, businesses, they all shut down, they all had to close. You had, I saw this video where there was this lady who had a restaurant and she was told she couldn't open it, but right next to her restaurant parking lot, you had Hollywood there, shooting a film, that's why I asked that question, because I feel like it's really ironic because a lot of our people are against capitalism. I would say, a lot of people who consider themselves Chicanos and raza, or people who are just socially conscious, what are against it. They hate it, because they tie it to imperialism, right? And to some extent, they're right, because imperialism gave birth to capitalism, right? Because like we talked about earlier with the Spanish, they came over here and they pretty much exploited the crap out of the people. In some cases they didn't pay them anything, and the country here, the US, was founded on trying to have capitalism because the founding fathers, their deal wasn't so much they wanted to be free from Britain. They just were not allowed to trade with other people. Like if you're a landowner, you couldn't buy land, west of, I think, the Mississippi, if I'm correct, or west of some river, so, but I agree with, if we really had a free market where, we didn't bail out these huge companies. I mean, even the banks, back in 2008, that would have killed, everything, but they bailed them out. And I agree that they should never bail them out, just like, you shouldn't bail out. I mean, it'd be nice if you got bailed out, but I mean, it should not come from the government, and even today, I mean, like, honestly, I mean, and you might not agree with this, or maybe you will. I think how we're living now is probably the closest we'll get to socialism. And I say that because a lot of people are in an economic situation because of the government shutdowns. You know what I mean? People lost their jobs. People lost their businesses. So what now? They depend on the government to give them, money, right? And all that spending, all that stuff that has been sent to us, people are like, oh, I got my stimmy, I got my money, right? But it's just causing inflation. It's, it's making things, cost more, and it's not really helping us out. But, if people see, oh, whoever's helping me out, then we should go vote for them, right? So I think this is the closest we've ever been to socialism, probably since the 1930s, you know what I mean? But that's how I feel about that. What about you, Brown? What do you think?
Yeah. So now, as for, you mentioned that, why do we, for the most part, not like, capitalism? I mean, if the majority of us were wealthy, I think we think differently about that, and 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 on top of that, bro, like, I read that because of inflation, Latinos that are well off are gonna get wealthier. So I wonder, like, in the next few years, how most of the Latino population will think about this, capitalistic way of society. So it's like, that's the thing, bro. Like, from one year to another, it depends on the individual. It's really the individual, that it depends on the view. So it's like, someone strikes a fucking lotto, they they ain't really gonna be looking at, oh, you know what, too bad, the poverty, the people in poverty, they're fucked, and I'm better off now, like, so it's really like, I don't know, bro. It's like this opportunistic way of living, and and it's like, it's kind of religion, bro. That's the way I kind of see, politics, taking a little bit of here, a little bit of there, because you can't really, I mean, can you fully embrace a side? Question to you, Carlos. I mean, can you fully embrace being being conservative, or is there little things that you pick from other ways of, yeah, there we go.
I believe I can fully embrace being conservative. It's just on a purely moralistic standpoint, I would say.
Okay.
As far as economics go, I do think that or people have experienced a bit of the benefits of capitalism, even though the idea is that we're not gaining the same level of wealth as the top whatever percent. I mean, just for example, just the buying power of the dollar in terms of the amount of food you could probably buy for it, and in terms of technological advancements. I mean, we all have smartphones now in Mexico, and more so. I mean, even and I'm just speaking from my experience, but even like the poor people down there, I mean, they're not exactly starving or anything like that. I mean, I would even say some might be a little bit, overweight. But I do think that that this was sort of a benefit because of that, of capitalism making things a lot cheaper for individuals, because I mean, we're not exactly like starving or anything like that down there. So and I mean, we all have pretty good smartphones and things like that. So I do think we have benefited to an extent, but maybe not in the sense that we don't have the same level of overall wealth compared to other groups of people.
Yeah.
And as far as what Flo was saying, I don't know if I would necessarily characterize the Spanish gaining and exploiting the wealth of the Americas as necessarily capitalism. I think that kind of misses the idea of a free exchange, free market between people. I mean, if somebody breaks into my house and like steals, my most precious items that I have, God forbid. I don't consider that a free exchange between groups of people. It sounds a little bit more forced, and yeah, so that's probably against capitalism. And as far as us living closest now to socialism, I suppose the inflation that we have, I guess, would be kind of like socialism, I suppose. I mean, I'm thinking of Venezuela for this, so I think there's a pretty fair case to be made that we are living the closest we'll possibly get to it, and that's basically just these payments given to us, by the government for not working because they obviously barred us from working. But I mean, this was all because of the COVID thing, so it's kind of hard to talk about economics with COVID and the free market because it's fairly unprecedented in my opinion.
You,
What do
you
you guys think?
mentioned Venezuela, and I would like to bring up Cuba. I mean, obviously, I don't know if you've been making yourself aware of the situation over there, but obviously I mean, they're going through a rough time there. I mean, and there's opponents of of capitalism who would say, well, it's not necessarily socialism's fault. It's the embargoes, right, that are causing uh, Cuba to not be able to feed its citizens, to thrive like the rest of Latin America or the U.S. I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you think it's the embargoes? Do you think it's socialism? Do you think it's a little bit of both? I mean, what do you think about that?
um I guess the embargoes would prevent um I guess the free exchange of trade between individuals. So perhaps that does play a role in the economic output of places like Cuba, for example, because they were under an embargo for many, many decades up until recently. But I mean, there's examples of other countries that have also gone socialist that didn't have that same level of embargo. And I guess I'm more leaning towards places like the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in particular, that they probably were able to trade amongst each other, but as far as the reason why these countries here in Latin America are not doing very well, I think it is a little bit of both. Perhaps if we did trade with them, maybe they would be doing a little bit better, but at the same time, I mean, just socialism is just not a very efficient method of producing wealth just in general. So even if it is a little bit both, us preventing trade or putting embargoes on them, I think it's probably more so the other half too, of just their system is probably just not that efficient, if that makes sense. But I would agree with you that there is, to some extent, we do play a role in the embargo, with
Yeah.
the embargo.
Any more thoughts, Brown? Questions?
Oh yeah, no, just off topic from what you guys were just discussing. What is the main thing that kind of like is a pet peeve of yours, Carlos, that you don't like when you address that you're a conservative?
Well, I haven't had very much backlash, thank God, and attending.
Kind of shocked. I mean, you live in Portland, so I would think that.
Yeah. And I think this is primarily because we were remote for the past year. But even before that, I mean, I did have some discussions with some of my colleagues over there, and I think it's generally it's the white liberals that have behaved more intolerant, towards me, interestingly.
Yes.
And I think it's because they're, supposedly supporting on my behalf, if that makes sense. And I guess they just get upset sometimes when I don't acknowledge my own marginalization as they see fit. But as far as pet peeves goes, I don't think I have any. I think it's just the idea of just mixing people and ideas, I guess, would be the pet peeve. Like, oh, you're a conservative, so therefore they lump you in with, group X or group Y, basically. And
Yeah.
I think it's just, yeah, that conflating of people and ideas and not being able to separate them, I think is probably the biggest pet peeve of mine, I would say. Does that
Now,
make
one more
sense?
question. Yeah. One more question though. On that line, what would the old you say to the new you?
Thank God. I don't know. Okay. No,
In
that's
what
me
way
saying
though?
that. That's me saying that to my old me. Never mind. The old me
Oh, okay.
saying the old me saying to the new me. I think they would probably say like, "What happened?" I would suppose, because
Mm.
I was very much in favor of, these ideas of, the Reconquista and things like that. Like this
Mm.
land, half of it was ours. It was stolen from us, and therefore, all these implications of why we're marginalized later on down the road, and we have the freedom to move between this and our former lands. So yeah, the old me would probably be like what the hell happened, basically.
Yeah, no doubt. Thanks for that.
Now, has your conservative values, has that affected how you vote? I don't know if you said you weren't old enough to vote the last time, I think. Is that what you said? If I'm correct.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that
Yeah.
I wasn't registered to vote for
Okay.
the 2016 presidential election, but in the midterms after that, I was able to vote, and I voted for Kate Brown, our current governor, and I also signed a petition to get her removed. I think a year later, so I think it was a pretty quick and certain conversion, I would say. So, yeah, it definitely impacts my voting now.
Now, as a conservative, do you tend to just lean Republican, or are you more like, okay, well, I'm going to look at their values? Because I mean, I know that a lot of the times they tie them together. Republicans tend to be more conservative than the Democrats. So, do you find yourself, doing that, or do you just vote for the person who you think has your best, your values, your best interest in your values?
Yeah, well, I guess in regards to attitudes towards the Republican Party, I think it's a lot like, individuals on the other side. Not all of them like what the Democrats are doing. Perhaps they're not going far enough, or perhaps they're going too far. I mean, I don't always agree with every single Republican, I would say. I mean, there's probably some things in general with the Republican Party that I may not, completely align with. But in general, I think I would much rather support the conservative ticket, even if it means voting for a Republican. Well, I think in this case it would primarily mean that. More so than I would, consider voting for a Democrat, if that makes sense. So in short, yes, I would probably, vote Republican just based on the conservative, attitudes towards values and things like that.
So, I mean, we obviously didn't discuss this here in our topics, but as far as your values, I mean, because from the conversation, it feels like you're more like economically conservative. Does that also apply to just like the way you see? Obviously, there's a lot of push, in society to be more liberal, to be more accepting of specific groups or whatever. Like, do you go to church? Like, do like, I guess the typical conservative? I mean, is that something that you also apply to your life, or no?
I guess not so much. I think you're right in characterizing me as a bit more like of a fiscal conservative, just from an economic perspective. But as far as the other values that go along with it, I would definitely agree with the whole family value thing. And but I mean, I'm not exactly the most avid churchgoer, I would say. Um, as far as higher power and things like that, I would agree that perhaps it is useful to believe in that, and I mean I believe in it myself. But the other things that are kind of pertaining to conservatives, with other values such as family and religion, and that even ties into other social issues like abortion. I think for the most part, I guess I would tend to agree with those things, but I mean, I'm probably much more from a practical economic perspective. That's kind of the kind of
Mm.
conservative I am. But the other issues that they have, like on abortion and family values and religion, I would generally lean towards and agree with.
Another question, bro?
No, it's just not surprising, you know what I mean? It's just like more of an observation. Like when you look at when you try to box someone into something, people expect that you have to fall under a certain category and you have to live kind of like off of that, off of that list of things that you're expected to live like, you know what I mean? And if you're off just a little bit, they're like, why don't you completely follow this list according to what you believe and what you stand for? Which is like, but then we go back to, but we're free to do what the fuck we want. You know what I mean? So it's like, why do you have to follow a certain list? Like, you know what I mean? So it's just, I mean, that's just how I've always like noticed that if you're a Catholic, you have to live life a certain way. If you're whatever, you're an atheist, you're expected to live life a certain way. So it's like they call you, they label you something, you're expected to fulfill that label. If not, then you're the exception or whatever. You know what I mean?
You actually they would actually put you with the other, right?
With the other, there we go.
Because you don't follow every single thing on the list, right? So that's interesting.
It is, man.
Yeah, what I would have I guess one more question before we end it. Like what are your thoughts on Lexit? I don't know if you heard of Lexit and Latinos for Trump. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think Lexit, I think that is derived from the Blexit, which is like the black exit from the Democratic Party, which I think would make more sense because I think in general blacks tend to vote more Democrats than Hispanics tend to vote for either one, I would say. So we're kind of more divided over here in terms of opinions, I would say. But well, I think it is a good thing. I mean, I think that all Hispanics or Latinos should vote Republican. I don't know if I would go with that either. I think if you have an opinion, it is up to me to kind of persuade you one way or the other, to do my very best. But should I say that you should do it just because I think so? I think that to be wrong. I would like for people to kind of look into these specific issues a little bit more in depth, to where maybe they're voting at least from a bit more of an informed perspective. Even if they're voting Democrats, I think the more informed as to why they're voting Democrat, I think would definitely be helpful, especially if you're trying to get people to realize that maybe not everything Democrats are doing are necessarily in our interest, if that makes sense.
What about Latinos for Trump?
Latinos for Trump. They exist. They have every right to exist. I'm not sure what the question is about them. Do I think they are a good thing, or what about them?
Just like, I know I think they're kind of connected, Lexit and Latinos for Trump. I think you kind of already answered it, I guess, when you said that you shouldn't really vote a certain way just because how you feel. And I think Latinos for Trump are on that belt. We shouldn't vote Democrat, therefore we should go vote for Trump, and he's the only one that we should vote for. And I challenge that because it goes back to well, we should vote Democrat because that's what's best for us. You know what I mean? Like it's a form of fanaticism, and I think I'm only a fan of football, bro. That's it. I'm not a fan of politics. I mean, I don't vote with my heart. I vote with logic when it comes to politics. So I don't I agree with those ideas. So that's why I asked you the question. I didn't think you were, but maybe I just wanted to see how you felt about it. But I guess to end today's podcast, I wanted to say that I think even though you call yourself a conservative, because that word carries a lot of weight. Like I said, just by posting it up, somebody said, "Get that shit out of my feed" on our Instagram. Somebody said that to us, or started saying, "Oh, or you guys are gonna bring in a coconut," or just stuff like that, just off the bat, because people don't even want to have a conversation with somebody who even uses that word, right? It's like almost like a sin or whatever, But like Brown has said in the past, that's why he doesn't use labels to identify himself, because like you said, I mean, he doesn't fit the whole checklist. And I think honestly, I find myself agreeing with you a lot in a lot of things, and I think I'm probably more fiscally conservative myself too. I'm more libertarian when it comes to social issues, but when it comes to economics, I think I'm right there with you, So it makes me realize, okay, well, maybe I'm on that side too, to some extent, which I'm okay with. I mean, if that's the case, I mean, like, it is what it is, and I'm not going to apologize for that. But yeah, I mean, and that's what I want to say. What about you, Brown? You want to end it with
Yeah, well, yeah, I have a few questions. So now, to you, I mean, how do you feel about Trump? I mean, would you vote for him if he came again, into running for president?
Yeah, I would certainly consider it. I think the main issue that people have is basically just around his character and things like that. I mean, I'm not really here to defend people, and I guess this is where I come to the separation between people and ideas, because ideas are very much bigger than people. And if voting for Trump entails that I am voting for more conservative values, then I will do that, regardless of how not completely regardless of how I feel about his personal character, but basically that comes sort of second when it comes to voting for parties, if that makes sense. Because I'm more in line to vote for the party that holds these values, even if it means electing an unconventional politician, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think we're all definitely sinners here for having a conservative on this podcast. And
now you obviously like do your homework into who you're voting, right? You're not like just voting for whoever you think is best candidate just based on just how they talk,
commercials,
the commercials, just the nice things that they put out there as ads, whatever. You obviously do your homework. So now, do you think that that it is one day possible for a Latino to run for president and to have the majority of the people's vote, not only because he's a Latino, but because he's representing something in a smart, logical, perspective standpoint, as for economics and social awareness, all these different, bundle of things? Do you think that there'll be that one day that there's that person for us, and everyone wants to vote from liberals to conservatives to everyone? Do you think that they will come?
I think you're talking about the second coming of Jesus, bro, right there.
Yeah. You might be named Jesus too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Go ahead, bro.
As far as in the near future, probably not, because I mean, like we mentioned earlier, Hispanics are not a collective monolithic entity.
Yeah.
We obviously have deep disagreements, and honestly, if we had a Latino candidate of either party, I think he might cause more division between us. It's kind of like, oh, it's them versus us sort of thing.
That's
so
true.
I think it'd be hard to bring, exactly, because I think it'd be hard to bring all Latinos together behind one candidate to be difficult, because we're all not, a collective monolithic group, basically. We already disagree with each other, and I think if somebody ran for either party, I think it would just exasperate those differences.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, in terms of, I mean, that's a very good point. See, that's the thing that that separates people from, like, unbelievers from the believers. Like, this, in every aspect of what we do in life as Latinos, we divide ourselves. And this is just another way of dividing ourselves within politics, and it's just like, I mean, the people that have businesses, of course, will for sure vote for Trump, because that's going to benefit them. So what people are going to, boycott these stores because they're voting Trump? No, it's just people want the benefits. You know what I mean? People want to prosper, right? So it's like, why even put the term you're a sellout if you vote for this person? Like, that's up to the individual. Like, we put the barriers there. We did that to ourselves. We said, oh, the people that have a logical way of thinking and they think they vote for someone, or they go for a certain party because they believe that's in terms of what they believe, that's better for them. And we're all really here for the betterment of our people. I mean, that's we're not gonna be like, you know, that we leave this to screw off our whole people, like, you know, our people, like our lineage or whatever. We're not, you know, so like, so why fight against something that we're trying to come up with a new standard, a new way of living. And this is what we've been given to work with. Unless we come up with, like I said, things come up all the time, the Green Party, this and this and that. Unless we come up with something that we can all agree on, which is going to be pretty much the same elements that we already have. So at the end of the day, you know what I mean? It's either this or that. It's more towards the individual than a collective, I think.
Yeah, no party is, you know, just for somebody unless they become a fanatic. Like I said, you know, you once you choose a side and you become a fanatic and you hate. Usually, it's really funny because usually when you pick a side, it's because you hate the other side. It's not not so much because you like your side. I mean, for example, during this whole, you know, this whole process, you know, the last you know, election, when people were saying, "Oh, vote for Biden because he's the lesser of two evils," it's like, really? That's your fucking logic? You're gonna vote for Biden because he's the lesser? You don't even like the guy. Like, come on, do some fucking research. You know, like it's really it's not even about who you actually want to vote for. You know, it's become that. You know, so. But yeah,
man, even the fly census bullshit, man. Even the fly census is bullshit.
Because I'm leaving. I'm not gonna.
Yes.
But on that note, I mean, I want to see if anybody dropped any comments or any questions. I know people are going to drop in, and if not, then, you know, we'll wrap it up. You know.
Yeah, man. But yeah, that's my last words too, man. Yeah, but you know what, bro? That's the thing, man. Like, you know, upon knowing, like, being ignorant, bro, and just going along with what the social media says, that someone that believes something else, you know, that's just totally like ignorance to the second power, bro. Because you may not know a person, and just based on what they believe, you're already trying to kill the person. And that's how religious wars start, bro.
Oh, man. Yep.
You feel me? So it's crazy. It's a crazy world, man.
What are your last words, Carlos? What do you want to say if people don't know about you that, you know, that you really think they should understand, you know?
I guess I would just say, just do your own personal research if you'd like to be more informed. I mean, don't just follow just, you know, one side of the ideological spectrum, I would say. Like for me, I like to follow, you know, both sides just so I can be more comprehensively informed. Like if one news outlet says this and the opposite side says this, then, you know, what's the same is fact and what they disagree on is their opinion, basically. So I guess, so yeah, basically just that, just keep an open mind, and maybe you'll see that we're not so different after all, you know?
You know, and it's really interesting you said that, because 10, 15 years ago, that's something that a liberal would say, you know, be open. Right now, it's like, no, like, you can't like that. You can't be with those people, you know? So how even the ideology has changed, right? So someone who's a conservative now, I would say, is more open-minded, you know, than a liberal. Liberals, you know, a lot of them are left. I would say more leftist, are full of anger and hate the other side, you know? And that's a huge reason why I don't associate with them, because at least, you know, when it comes to politics, because I just don't feel like I can be part of that group. I don't hate people. You know, I did at one point, you know, not anymore. I mean, I'm beyond that. I can't live my life hating somebody. I can't live my life living for somebody else because of what happened, you know, centuries ago, you know. But yeah, I mean, on that note, if there's no more comments, you know, questions, I do want to say thank you very much for jumping on. I know you hit us up, you know, a few months ago. You went out of your way to hit us up, and I really appreciate that. You know, I'm not sure how you came across us, but I mean, I'm glad that you did. To have somebody in here that's pretty well read and just knows your stuff, and you know. So if you could do me a favor and you know, send us those links to those books that you know, you mentioned, so I can put them in the description, and so people can just, you know, if you have an open mind, if you're open to learning, go check out those books, man. I mean, I think the second one, I think I read it myself. I think Harvest of an Empire. I think that's the one you mentioned. I think I read part of it myself. Yeah. But on that note, this is Flo and Brown.
Oh, one last question, bro. One last question.
Go ahead.
My bad. Carlos, what do you think about the Latinx?
There it is.
Uh, well, I would say that it's a little odd to try to. I mean, the whole Spanish language is gendered. I mean, what are we gonna apply that to every like niños and niñas? Are we gonna say like niñex or something? Because I think it's primarily American liberals, not necessarily Hispanic ones.
White liberals.
Yeah,
Mm.
primarily American liberals that push these things onto other groups that are also marginalized, if that makes sense. So I wouldn't use Latinx, but if somebody would like to do so, then they are free to do so.
We are in America.
There it is.
We are in America.
Yes.
Hey, thanks, man. I appreciate this conversation, bro.
Likewise. All right, now it is Raza Stand Podcast.
Hey,
Take a stand.
to understand.
All right. Take care, man.